Welcome back, everybody, to another Danny Phantom review. It's been a hot minute since I've recorded one of these, but anyways, we're continuing through Season 3 with the episode Livin Large. This one I barely remember, which is probably because not a whole lot really happens. Yeah, let's get into it. So the plot of this one, the guys in white realize that the Fentons actually are the most successful ghost hunters in the world, and they offer to buy their lab and all their equipment for like $1 billion or whatever. And so the Fentons accept and move out and buy a mansion. That's this episode is, look, what if Danny was rich? Yeah, it's kind of strange. There really isn't a whole lot to this one. It's very simple and predictable. Guys in white buy the Fenton's place. Now Danny and his family are rich. At first, they think that being rich is great because they have a butler and they have all this extra money and stuff and a big house and all the cool things that will come from being rich. But then, Danny kind of stops going to school and loses interest in his friends. He starts to feel lonely and disconnected from the world. Meanwhile, Sam discovers that the guys in white are up to no good. They want to blow up the ghost zone with essentially a nuclear weapon, which is why they've purchased the Fenton's house, because they have the ghost portal. And then they kind of establish in this episode that the ghost zone and the real physical world are connected, and so if you destroy the ghost dimension, the regular world will also get destroyed.
What happens when an entire dimension is suddenly removed from a plane of existence?
Easy. The whole dimensional structure becomes unstable and kaflooey.
Well, the ghost zone is the flip side of our plane of existence. If it goes, we go.
They kind of hinted at some kind of connection between the two worlds earlier in this season. So although this is kind of a change in the lore up to this point, I'm not entirely against it, and this idea does end up coming back later in the season. So at least this season kind of has some continuity between some of the new lore that they establish, and that it all kind of builds to something, kind of. But anyways, Danny eventually learns the really obvious lesson that, money isn't everything, and if you're not connected to your friends and stuff like that, then, you can lose a sense of who you are. Really basic stuff that we've seen 100 times. And then Danny eventually agrees to go with Sam and stop the guys in white. There's a kind of fun sequence here at the end. Also, this is like the last 6 minutes of the episode where Danny finally decides to do something about, the only conflict in this episode. But he goes into the ghost zone, he steals Johnny 13's bike, and he's driving around. He bumps into Youngblood, who has a brief cameo in this episode, which is kind of fun. I completely forgot that he ever showed up again after the first couple episodes with him. This time he's got an astronaut aesthetic, which I think is fun. Again, kind of that playful nature of the character where he's this little kid who likes to play pretend, and this week he happens to be into astronauts. That stuff I think is kind of fun, but it's super, super brief here. And yeah, he very briefly teams up with a couple of the ghosts from the ghost zone in order to stop the big nuclear ghost weapon from blowing up the entire ghost zone. And that stuff at the end I think is kind of fun. And there's nothing particularly or specifically bad or offensive about this episode. It just feels very low stakes, which is strange for an episode that technically has the highest stakes of any episode we've seen up to this point. If the guys in white succeed in their plan to destroy the entire ghost zone in this episode, they will effectively wipe out our entire dimension. The stakes have never been higher, and yet the stakes have never felt lower. Writing or anything isn't specifically bad in this episode. It's just Danny's hanging out in the mansion that he has in this episode, and that's most of the episode. Sam, once again, is the only proactive character and is the only one to decide to investigate why the guys in white wanted to buy their house in the first place. And then when she finally does and tells Danny about it, he just kind of acts out of character and is it'll be fine, I'm rich this episode, so I don't care. It's just kind of sloppy, where Danny gets put in this situation where he becomes rich so that he can act out of character in order for him to learn a really obvious lesson that he probably would have known by this point, because it's very similar to many lessons that he's learned before this. You should help people with your powers. It's he knows this already. He shouldn't be learning this lesson again, kind of thing. It's just kind of not very well pace. There isn't any real action until the last like 6 minutes or so. Not that it necessarily needs that, but like it's just kind of weird little things where like the guys in white are here, which is fine. They're really fun in their first appearance, but by this point in the show they've shown up a bunch of times, and they show up more often the second half of the series overall. And I like some of the concepts here of them becoming more involved and more interested in the Fentons, realizing that they actually are the most successful ghost hunters and have the most connections to the ghost zone and the ghost world and all that stuff. Like it's a subtle underlying plot thread throughout the series that's kind of interesting, but I don't think that it ever really goes anywhere or pays off in an interesting way. The first couple episodes that the guys in white show up in, there's also like other stuff going on. The first one with them, they also had this like Scooby-Doo-esque team. I forget what they're called, but their Scooby-Doo equivalent is called Scaredy Cat, and they have a Shaggy analog. All that stuff is really fun as well. The guys in white are also much funnier in that first appearance, and a lot of their other appearances, there's also something else going on, like the Infinity Gauntlet episode with Freak Show. They're in that one as well, but Freak Show is kind of the main antagonist of that one. The guys in white just also happen to be involved. But this one, it's just them. They're the only antagonists. There's nothing else going on. Danny doesn't have like a big test or anything else that he's got to worry about. So that's the only antagonistic force, and they're kind of in the background for most of the episode. And there's other little things too, like Vlad shows up in this episode because the Fentons move into a big mansion in the rich neighborhood near where Vlad lives. Now he's their neighbor. Does he do anything in this episode? Does he affect the plot at all? No, not really. So again, it just kind of like overall this season, Vlad becomes less and less threatening as a villain as he has more and more appearances, because we know that like he doesn't matter all of the time, which, you know, him being the main villain of the series is kind of a problem, that he doesn't have like a huge role in a lot of these little episodes where he continues to show up. Danny Phantom's show about relatable problems that every teenager faces, like the government paying you millions of dollars to move into a mansion that make and become rich. You know, everyday problems that normal teenagers face. I don't know. Maybe I'm being too harsh on this episode. There's some fun moments with Danny's family as usual, and it's not terribly written like some episodes this season. Tonally, the characters feel mostly in line with how they do the majority of the series. There's just some pacing issues with this episode, as well as like it not really mattering in the grand scheme of things. Despite the literal stakes for the characters of the episode being the biggest they've ever been, emotionally the stakes are Danny has to learn that being rich isn't everything, which is like a lesson he already knew. I don't know. I'm overthinking this episode. It's mostly just an unmemorable episode. I kind of forgot this one existed entirely, and I will probably forget about it not that long after watching. It's not terribly offensive, but it's not great or memorable either, and it really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. And that's it. So we will continue our journey through season 3 next time, and I will see you then.